Hello everyone, dear friends, this is Nikita with you again, and we are continuing our course dedicated to creating surgical guides in the RealGUIDE software. Today we have an even more interesting case ahead because we will be making a split surgical guide with immediate loading and attaching it in fact to the main base of the guide. In short, it's going to be interesting. If you want to learn how to make these surgical guides, as they say, under my close and attentive supervision or under the careful guidance of my colleagues right here with us in person, then you'll find a lot of interesting things at the link in the description. And after a short break, as always, we continue. So we continue our work. And today, as you can see, we have a rather interesting case. And here on our 3D scene, we have lots and lots of files, but let's go through everything step by step. First of all, we have a CT scan here. Here it is. We also have an intraoral scan here. By the way, all the teeth here will be extracted, and then we will plan everything on 4 implants with immediate loading. Here, we also have this adapter file, which I'll talk about a bit later. And here is a wax-up of the F-PON type, meaning this is already a template for the prosthetic structure. It was made in RealGUIDE, in ExoCAD, and in this same ExoCAD, this file was created, which serves as an adapter. So this file contains both the wax-up and essentially the merged cross-reference scan. This is necessary in order to align everything together, because you can't properly transfer the positions of STL files from ExoCAD to RealGUIDE without losing their coordinates, which is why such files are created. So when you are working in RealGUIDE, once again in ExoCAD, when you create a wax-up like this in ExoCAD, make sure to do this kind of merging, that is, combine it with your scan so that everything can be aligned in RealGUIDE. Now let's go through everything step by step. As you can see, all our files are, so to speak, scattered around. And now we're going to work on aligning everything. Well, first we need to align the anatomical model with the CT scan. Let's do that. And here we click on Assisted. If you've already watched our previous videos, if you've already found this video at later stages when you were modeling all this together with MII, if you've completed the previous lessons, then this step is probably already clear to you. There. Of course, the artificial intelligence didn't align anything properly because the crowns are poorly captured here due to noise. Now we're going to do all of this manually. Let's choose the most suitable spots for this. For example, 2 to 3. There. Now things look a bit better. What should we pay attention to when, let me say it again, what should we pay attention to when our alignment, let's say, is not quite right? First of all, it's the contour. You can pay attention to the contour of the palate only in the area of the hard palate, because in the area of the soft palate, the mucosa will change depending on the act of breathing. And again, we look at all the slices to make sure everything is as it should be everywhere. But here, this is probably just temporary crown, which is why it simply didn't show up. All right, good. Well, overall, I think everything is okay. You can click Apply and save the project. Let's save it. And now, look, we have an anatomical model. In other words, the scan is now aligned with the CT scan. Our task now is to align this wax up just as we planned, so that we can then use it accordingly to position the implants and link it to the surgical guide. That's exactly why, I repeat, we exported this merge file. We also call it an adapter, so that we can align everything properly. Now, look, we click on this adapter, and now we're going to match it as well, but not with the die model, but with the STL. To do this, we click STL on STL. Now, what's the most important thing here? Here you need to look at this from and to file. In other words, from is the object you want to align, and to is the object you want to align it with. So everything is correct here, and let's use a tool called By Brushes. Honestly, this is the fastest way. For this, we simply find matching areas on both cans and paint over them with this tool. paint once, paint twice, and then click Fit. If everything worked correctly, you should see a lot of blue, just like here. So if you see a lot of this blue color, it means your alignment is spot on. This means the scans are absolutely identical to each other and accordingly are in the same coordinate system. So we can continue working. Click OK, then apply changes, just in case I save the project again so nothing crashes or gets lost. And now, as the final step, we align the wax up. We click matching STL to STL, and here once again we double check everything. But now you see here the program has selected the files, so no, it actually selected them correctly, just as before. So we are aligning the wax up to this adapter. That's why we click again. And now I just brush over these crowns, because in these scans, the crowns themselves are identical. I click and you see, again, we have a lot well here. It's kind of there in the, they tried to drill the channels before, but right now we don't need to pay attention to that. The main thing is that all our crowns are now in the same coordinate system. We have a lot of blue color, which means the alignment is perfect. We click OK, we click, and basically this adapter, if you're satisfied with the alignment and I am satisfied, here we can delete it, because believe me, in the next steps we will have a lot of different files that will get in our way. We click, and it's important to make sure we've selected the correct object, and this is what we end up with. Overall, you can already see how the technician planned this structure, that our avoid zones have been preserved. And basically, let's get started with the planning. We click on the CPR plane. Since we are working with the upper jaw, we don't need to outline the nerve. We click, the program handles this perfectly. Let's wait a little. That's it. And now we move on to the wax up planning stage. But since we've already done the wax up, we don't need to add anything extra here. There's no need to struggle with these widgets. We can proceed to the planning stage. And in fact, here we are at the planning stage. Now, all that's left for us is to choose accordingly to place the implants and set the fixation pins. We'll talk about them a bit later. Well, let's start, yes. Also, what's most important is that at this stage, we already need to know which kit we're working with, because it's very important for us to see which sleeves we'll be using. Let's start by, placing one implant, then two. And actually, I've selected Noble here, probably because I used this system in my previous work. Well, let's just stick with it. What difference does it make, really? And here, when working on full arch cases, it's very important to immediately try on the multi-units, so that first of all, we can see where the channel will emerge. And secondly, it's about the height of the multi-units themselves, checking how it will relate to the gum. Okay, good. Now we need to select a straight multi-unit. Well, let's say, for example, if we have a slight submergence, we'll choose 2.5 millimeters. You see, our clinical neck will be here, and the platform of the multi-unit will be about 1.5 millimeters below the clinical neck, which in principle is quite good for this type of construction. We click, and everything turned out all over the place for us. All right, now let me hide this so it's a bit easier for me. For now, I'll preliminarily set it to a 2. It's coming out badly for me. This is roughly how it should look. To be honest, I don't really like it. I'll probably choose a slightly smaller implant diameter, for example, 375. In the front, basically, that's fine. And I'll also choose a multi-unit. Most likely, when I place the distal implants, these multi-units, or rather these front implants will move, and I'll show you why. But for now, let's mark it out like this because it's much more difficult to place the distal implants. Now I'll place them. I probably won't comment much for now. I'd rather talk about everything once we've finished the construction. I mean, once I've positioned the implants, I'll give a more detailed commentary. Right now, thinking and talking at the same time is pretty difficult for me personally. All right. Now, let's place the implants. I'm also checking the cortical plates to make sure they're preserved, like from the sky, okay? From the sky. If anything, a couple of turns from the sky in the neck area, exposure is allowed. There's nothing particularly serious about that. Right. It's much more important not to damage the vestibular cortical plate. And I'll adjust the angle a little. All right, now it's starting to come together. Excellent. Now let's move on to the distal sections. And let me remind you that in the distal areas, we place the implants at an angle tangential to the sinus. So here is where the sinus will be. And this is roughly how we position the distal implants. So here it is, the sinus. And tangential to the sinus, as if an arrow is just touching it, we place the distal implant. We could probably even use a slightly larger one. And in addition, let's also place, that's just the software warning me that the sleeve is hitting the anatomical model. Let's go ahead and place an angled implant at 30 degrees with the idea of bringing it out to the premolar. I mean the implant channel. All right, I'm clicking apply. I'm checking how everything is turning out. Now I'll adjust the angle a little bit. Like this. Well, let's say, okay, by the way, let me check here as well, but here, of course, it's a bit too close to the cortical plate right here. But overall, I'll move it just a little bit more like this. There, I think that's fine. Everything looks good. Let's double check here as well on this slice. Everything's okay here too. And now we move on to the 2.5. Here as well, we have an overlap of the safety zones of the frontal and distal implants, and we can't leave it like that. Well, some people leave it like that, but I don't recommend it. I don't recommend violating the safety zones. We also place it tangentially. Here, the implant can be rotated just a little bit. Tilt it slightly and see what we end up with for a moment. There's some bone rarefaction here, but for now it's hard to say whether it's a cyst or something else. If this were a real case, I'd probably be considering whether or not to place the implant here. But for now, let's not focus on that, though it's good that we noticed it. We'll keep it in mind. So this is roughly the situation we have. And when we work with multi-units, it's very important to understand what angle we'll have between these channels. That is the angle between the axes of the multi-unit platforms. And to measure exactly what angle we'll have, there's a cool tool called Show Implant Angles. I click on it, and for example, right now I have implant 1, 2 selected, which I can set as the master, meaning make it the primary one. And I can see that the angle accordingly between the front implants is 5.7, and between 1, 2, and 2.5 the angle will be almost 20 degrees well, 19.1. And the angle between 1, 2 and 1.5 will be 17.8. Actually, that's quite a lot, of course. But overall, as a rule, multi-units, as far as I know, though I'm not a prosthodontist, can compensate for up to 20 degrees, basically. So I think that's okay. You could tilt it just a little bit more than What else would I like to say here about these angles? What can be done in such situations? What can be done in such situations? Here's what you can do. For example, if these angles don't match up at all, in other words, if they diverge completely, so for instance, our maximum angle divergence was 19 degrees, but if you have, say, 25 degrees or more in the anterior region, you can try using 15-degree multiunits, but most likely the shaft of the multiunit will end up coming out roughly on the palatal surface. In other words, it will be projected palatally as the first point. The second point, for example, you can try adjusting the angulation of the distal implants, but there you also need to take the sleeve into account. By the way, speaking of sleeves, we're about to place them now. Let's leave the arrangement as it is. I always save after each key step, and I recommend you do the same because the program sometimes crashes and doesn't always work stably. I've saved. Let's continue. So 1, 2, implant, and now we're going to select the sleeve. Selecting the sleeve. I'll be working with the RealGUIDE kit, and specifically I'll be working with an increased offset. Right now I see that my sleeve is sinking in quite a lot, and RealGUIDE has drills that are, how many millimeters is that? 16 millimeter drills. Accordingly, I can increase the offset by 3 millimeters and thereby compensate for the difference between the 16 millimeter drill and the 13 millimeter implant. By the way, if you don't understand what's going on, we have a video on the channel about this topic, how to calculate all of this. Let's increase the offset, and as a result, the sleeve has been raised. So now let's do the following. Now let's take this sleeve. Yes, here we've taken it. Now we can do the same thing. Let's see, how are things with 8 millimeters? And I see that the sleeves are at completely different heights. That's not a very good sign. And here's what I did here. The platforms of the implants themselves are at completely different heights here. When we plan like this, ideally, at least the front implants should be at the same level. So I either need to lower this one or accordingly raise this one. Let's take a look. Here it is, basically the edge of the cortical plate. How far is it here to the clinical neck? The clinical neck is here. Let's try lowering it a little bit like this. Well, I think basically nothing. The question here will be about primary stability, of course, because this root that we're removing is quite, although actually I think, well, in the cervical area it's actually pretty wide. And further on, we can see that the socket will most likely be completely along the bone, so there will be at least some primary stability. So more or less they're at the same level, which is actually nice. Ideally, this implant here could be placed just a bit lower in terms of level. And let's see if it's actually in the bone. It's best to check this on the axial slice, because you can see every facet of the implant. Yes, in fact, everything looks good. And now let's move on to selecting the sleeves for the distal sections. So of course, here as well, everything is lit up in red, which is understandable. All right, here let's also add 3 millimeters, considering that we'll be using a 16 millimeter drill. So we add these 3 millimeters here. Here, this problem disappears, which is very good. And here as well, it's about to light up red because it's pressing against the mucosa, which is understandable. There you go. So what do we have here? Basically, when you increase the offset as I just did, you need to understand that you're unlikely to be able to use the standard navigational implant driver, because the standard navigational implant driver is designed for this specific value, which is 5 millimeters. If we increase the offset by 3 millimeters like I just did, then you'll have to turn it an extra 3 millimeters. That's it. Turning the implant further isn't really an issue, especially if you're using straight multi-units, because in that case the rotation of the implant's internal hex isn't as important. But if these are angled implants like the ones I just worked with, then it becomes extremely important because the implant's internal hex will determine the orientation of the multi-units and the position of the multi-units screw channel. By the way, we actually have on our website specifically for this kind of situation special navigational implant drivers with an increased offset. That is, an extra 3 millimeters have been added to these drivers. And with a standard navigational implant driver, it's unlikely that you'd be able to do this kind of work. But with our navigational implant driver, you'll be able to do this work. Just so you know, I mean, I want you to be aware that there are tools that allow you to work here with a navigational implant driver with an increased offset. But in any case, this doesn't directly relate to this particular case. So now, let's say we're happy with everything. We like the position of the implants. Of course, it's showing red here because, let's say, there's a collision between the sleeves and the scan, but we'll deal with that later. Now, let's set the fixation pins. If our guide is detachable, then ideally there should be at least 5 fixation pins. Here we are not going to make any, let's say, onlay guide. Here we'll be working from the mucosal level. To position the fixation pins, it's very important to capture this transitional fold. Here, this is a good scan because we've captured everything right up to the transitional fold, which is great. We try to position the fixation pins as evenly spaced as possible so that they provide, let's say, maximum stability for our entire structure. So now I just need to look for a slightly better spot for them. I don't like it here. The fixation pins, of course, should not press against the tooth root and should not violate the implant safety zone. Let's look for a spot a little farther away. Maybe here. Yes, this is really starting to look about right. And let me also gently and carefully place a fixation pin here as well. So we're getting something more or less like what we want, but it really feels like we need 2 more fixation pins from the pallet. We'll look for spots for those now as well, but it's going to be more difficult. By the way, notice that I'm also using fixation pins from the RealGUIDE kit. So keep that in mind. There's a reason I'm doing it this way. That is, I chose the RealGUIDE kit and I'm selecting the sleeves for ET. My first choice for fixation pins is the RealGUIDE kit. If I had a different navigation kit, then I would be choosing different sleeves accordingly. And I would also be choosing different fixation pins. All right, let's say like this. But honestly, I don't really like it when the fixation pins are placed so close to each other. Right now, we have a safety zone here. If we go further, we are hitting the sinus. So in principle, I think this is a pretty good spot, good access. Overall, everything looks pretty good. Let's look at it from the other side. And by the way, when you're placing fixation pins from the pallet, you always need to remember to make sure the fixation pins don't interfere with each other. In other words, there shouldn't be. Let me show you something like this. Hold on, just the other way. The mouse isn't cooperating. Basically, you need to make sure that you can actually place the pins plain and simple, but the program will let you know if anything is touching or overlapping. So there's basically no bone here at all. That's not good. Although actually, yes, this is a good spot. We've found some kind of bone island. That's very good. All right, let's check everything again. You can set them at slightly different angles just to make drilling more convenient. and already set them at slightly different angles just to make drilling more convenient. And now we need to understand where the boundary of our template will be. So basically, when all these teeth are gone here, they're being removed, our template will look something like this. And accordingly, next we will be working on placing the detachable parts of the template and making the template specifically for preparing the bone bed. I double check everything again. It's not that I'm slowing down, I'm doing this work together with you, of course, without any cuts or editing. You can actually see firsthand how I position the implants and what I pay attention to. To be honest with you, if this weren't a training exercise, because of things like this, I would recommend people use a radiopaque template here. Because this kind of work specifically with split templates, immediate tooth extraction and immediate loading requires a high level of precision. And here, simply because you can see the teeth on your screens right now, the CT scan is of poor quality, meaning not all the contours of the teeth are visible, like for example on the lower jaw. I would have prescribed a radiopaque template in this case. If you don't know what that is, you can watch our previous video where we showed how we did it, for example on the edentulous jaws. But this thing would have been necessary here. For now, we can more or less ignore this and work with what we have, because what's important for us here is to understand the algorithm for the split template. We've already done most of the work in this case when it comes to planning the implantation and planning the fixation pins. And even though we spent some time planning everything, uploading it into WhatsApp and aligning everything in a single coordinate system, this isn't even the beginning yet, because the main work will start when we begin making the templates and connecting them to each other. But that, dear friends, as you might have guessed, will be in the next video, since our videos are about half an hour each. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Share it with your colleagues. Let knowledge be free. See you next time when we will be working with this case. Like and subscribe. Bye bye.